Grant, you just want to check that your video and your microphone are working? Grant, are you able to hear me?
I am, yeah. Sorry, just had to hit the mute and start video button. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you perfectly, thank you, yes.
Super.
And I can see you.
Oh, goodness. Never mind, eh? Can't have everything.
Great. So we'll start in a minute's time. I can see quite a lot of people joining. This is obviously a topic of interest for many people. So we'll give people a few minutes just to join. And also, if you continue to introduce yourselves, please, with your name, country, and organization. For those of you who are not familiar, there's a chat function in the middle of the screen. If you could please introduce yourselves there. As I mentioned, we will remain mute and keep our videos off, except for the presenter today and also myself, who will be facilitating. So welcome to the Pesticide Discussion Forum that is run by the University of Cape Town in South Africa and also funded by Sweden through the Swedish chemical agency, Chemi. I am Professor Andrea Rother. I'm head of the Environmental Health Division in the School of Public Health and Family Medicine at the University of Cape Town, and you are all most welcome. It's very nice to see so many people coming on for this topic. So the Pesticide Discussion Forum is a community of practice. This is not a webinar, rather it's an opportunity for us to discuss different topics around pesticides with different stakeholders, and I can see from many of you introducing yourselves that you represent different stakeholder groups, and particularly focusing on low and middle income countries who have to deal with various pesticide and regulatory issues. And we are very fortunate today to be able to discuss the risks associated with application of pesticides by drone. And I think this is quite a new and hot topic for many of us in low and middle income countries. Just a reminder that this is a non-partisan community of practice, so we may not agree with each other's opinions, but we will respect each other, and we will encourage you all to discuss in the chat. As I mentioned, please do continue to introduce yourselves with your name, country, and organization. When you respond to a question or when you make a comment in the chat, if you could please include your country, that makes it a bit easier for the presenter. So it gives me great pleasure then to introduce to you today Grant. Sorry, I'm just, there we go. Grant Stark, who is heads up the evidence committees and new technologies team in the Chemicals Regulation Division of the United Kingdom's Health and Safety Executive. And as I said, it's really a pleasure to be able to welcome Grant to lead us through this discussion. He has worked in a variety of roles related to pesticide regulation for almost 30 years. He's been involved with authorization documents and setting maximum residue levels in foodstuffs, ranging monetary programs and proposing. We seem to be having some. Tato, could you mute, please? Thank you. I was also muted, thanks. in that attempt, we all got muted. So let me go back to my introduction and find my notes. There we go. So I was introducing Grant Stark from the Health and Safety Executive in the United Kingdom. His current role includes regulation of new technologies, which is perhaps why he's leading us in the discussion today on drones. He's the chair of the OECD subgroup that is developing guidance for regulatory authorities on how to assess human and environmental risks from the application of pesticides by using drones. Grant, again, thank you very much for taking time out of your busy schedule to lead us through this discussion. We've got 70 people on already. As you can see, it's attracting people from all over in different sectors. So we look forward to what you have to say, and I hand over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea. Can I just check that you can hear and see me okay? Yeah, it's good.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, just to repeat what Andrea said, my name is Grant Stark. I'm a policy officer with the UK Health and Safety Executive, and we're the central government body in the UK responsible for the registration of pesticides. I'm also chair of this OECD subgroup that's looking at the risks associated with the application of pesticides by drones, the issue we're looking at here today. And so I must confess, before the universities got in touch with me to invite me to sort of lead this workshop with you, I was sort of unaware of this sort of program of activity, but I can see you're doing sort of good and important sort of work here, and it's a very sort of impressive sort of program that you've put together. So I'm looking forward to our discussions here this afternoon. I'm accompanied this afternoon by a number of my sort of colleagues from the UK sort of regulatory authority. They cover a range of sort of activities involving the sort of processing of authorizations for pesticide application products, but also sort of aspects of the detailed sort of risk assessment that's conducted with regard to pesticides. So my colleagues sort of Tony Wilson and Mark Curtis, Claire Glennie, Bryn Bircher and Tony Fisher will be on hand throughout the course of the discussion to pick up sort of aspects and issues that we identify, some of the stuff that will come through on the chat. So if we can't get to anything this afternoon, please don't worry. We'll look to sort of pick up things after the meeting. And of course, anyone on the call, you're welcome to get in touch with me at sort of any point afterwards, just to discuss any of the issues that we may sort of touch upon this afternoon. Okay, so just looking at the slide in front of us at the moment, when we're talking about drones, a very sort of fundamental question is what do we mean? And when the issue of sort of drone spraying was first mentioned to me as a possibility, back in 2016 in the UK, so I suspect that's relatively recently compared to a number of sort of countries. I thought immediately about the type of machine that you see in the top sort of left-hand corner of the slide. But we very quickly realised that was not the case. And certainly for the application of pesticides, the sort of machinery that we're looking at is very much that you see in the bottom two pictures on the slide here. So 2, 4, 6, 8 sort of rotor machines with sort of spray nozzles sort of hanging sort of below the rotors or below the sort of the main sort of structure of the drone equipment. And that's certainly the basis on which the OECD work has been sort of proceeding. So can we just go to the next slide, please, Tatum? Okay, so the first sort of challenge for us when we were introduced to the sort of concept of drones being used to apply pesticides was establishing how different the risk associated with drone spraying is from existing forms of application technology. And as a sort of regulatory authority, and sort of one of our sort of key goals is to avoid adding unnecessary degree of sort of complication to the regulatory system that we are operating. Avoiding complexity, it can help sort of users to understand the requirements that they're operating, and sort of reduces costs on the various sort of industries that are involved. So our natural sort of inclination was to say, look, if drones could be considered equivalent to an existing form of application, and that meets the requirements of all parties considered involved in the process, then that was a sort of desirable position to reach. So we did an initial bit of work to try and establish how different the risks associated with drone spraying were. And we recognized that the basis of sort of pesticide sort of legislation and regulation continues to focus mainly on the products, but there is an element of considering how methods of application may affect the risk profile of the products. And so what you got here on this slide is a representation of the sort of equipment that we have, certainly here in the UK, that's used to apply sort of pesticide sort of products. So it goes from the plastic bottle you see at the left-hand side, that's typically used in the UK in home and garden sort of situations, through use of sort of knapsack sort of sprayers, which tend to be used in the amenity or the non-agricultural situations, predominantly in the UK. There's limited sort of field use. Goes up through the use of the tractors or the boom sprayers that would typically be applied to broadacre crops. And on what we call the broadcast air-assisted sort of sprayers that you would see in sort of vineyards or orchard type situations, through to the helicopter spraying, aerial spraying towards the right-hand side. And you'll see from that, in a very sort of broad and general sense, there's an increasing risk associated with the application of pesticides that are applied by these different means. And in order to manage those risks and control exposure of people and the environment to pesticides, increasing levels of mitigation are used to manage the risks there. And the work that we are doing, the work that we have done to this point in time, so it suggests that the risk profile from drones, and bear in mind that there are lots of different risks associated with the application of pesticides, tends to sort of sit towards the right-hand side of this sort of slide here. So around what we call the broadcast sort of air-assisted sprayer use. But in order to sort of unlock the full potential of drone use, we don't think that it's appropriate to rely or consider classified drones as falling neatly within the sort of the risk profile, the envelope of the sorts of equipment that we see here on the screen. So the emerging view would seem to be to say that in order to make the greatest use, the most potential of drones as a new method of technology is to seek to create a bespoke way of regulating for drones, and this will form sort of the basis of the discussions that we're going to have this afternoon. Just take me to the next slide, Tatum, please. Okay. So we've talked very sort of briefly about the sort of benefits of sort of drone spraying. So this slide provides a little more sort of detail on that. And I think this sort of shows why governments are generally sort of supportive of new sort of technologies and technologies such as drones. And we are aware that there's a proportion of our societies who are sort of uncomfortable with pesticide use in whatever form it's carried out. And certainly in Europe and the UK, there are sort of particular concerns around the use of aerial spraying. So that does suggest the need to proceed with some degree of caution for some countries when it comes to the regulation of aerial spraying generally and drone spraying in particular. And I think it's important to point out that drones are part of a much bigger sort of technical revolution that's taken place in farming, driving towards far greater sort of precision with the application of pesticides and other chemicals. So we're going to see things like a combination of technologies such as use of sort of artificial intelligence, big data, remote sensing, sort of robotics, and even in time things like gene editing, are going to result in much more precise and sort of better time sort of application of pesticides, management of sort of pests, weeds and diseases in crops. And the aim of all of this should be a reduction in risks to people and the environment. So say the ultimate goal of this should actually enable pesticides themselves to be applied in a more sustainable fashion than is currently done. And of course, this does create sort of challenges and opportunities for farmers and other users of pesticides, and for us as a sort of regulator. I mean, these sort of sophisticated, they're enabling technologies are going to require new skills and perhaps new technological sort of infrastructures in the areas where the technologies are used. And for us as sort of regulators, I think some of the models or assumptions that we use to enable sort of pesticide risks to be established, we may need to sort of revisit that to make sure it's granular enough to sort of capture the new degree of sort of precision that are likely to come from the new technologies. So let's say, as the slide says, it's driving a bit of sort of cultural change and sort of new thinking among sort of regulators about how we might address sort of risk. So none of this sort of stuff is going to happen very, very quickly. So the effects are likely to be seen in the medium to longer term, but there are things that we now need to begin sort of thinking about. Okay, next slide, Tatum. Okay, so as I mentioned, the sort of challenge for the regulatory authorities at the moment is that we do not sort of fully understand the risks associated with the pesticides from these newer technologies, and in particular sort of drones. And so this was the conclusion of an OECD discussion back in 2019. And there was agreement to establish a subgroup to develop understanding and evidence on the risk from drone spraying, and see how that differed from the risks that arise from application of pesticides by existing technologies. So the group was sort of convened, and we arranged for a global call for information, and this was sort of directed to sort of regulators, to industry, and research organizations. And it was, the information was collected, it was collated and evaluated by a consultant that the subgroup employed, supported by sort of regulatory sort of experts from the UK, Australasia, and the US, and other countries that were represented on the group. And this enabled the OEC subgroup to produce the report that you see on the slide here. So that report was adopted at the end of 2021, and it established a number of areas to where sort of evidence and information was required to enable sort of regulators to assess the risk from drone spraying. So can you just go on to the next slide, Tatum? Thank you. So that report on the previous slide represented phase one of the OECD work. So we're able then to say what we do know about the risk from drone spraying and what we don't know, and what the nature of the risks appeared to be. And a sort of key conclusion was that sort of future work is necessary to build sufficient understanding of the risks of sort of drone spraying, and develop sort of recommendations for information or models that are required to enable regulators and others to quantify and mitigate the risks. And this is what we're doing now in phase two of the OECD work. And you'll see from this slide here that we divided activity into a number of work packages. So they're sort of designed to help assess the spray drift from drones and what sort of trials might be necessary to generate sort of information to make an assessment of spray drift. As we'll see later this afternoon, sort of spray drift is perhaps the key area where we need to get a better handle on the risk from drone spraying. Also need to do as sort of regulators a bit of work around understanding what a drone looks like. And this is a drone for sort of modeling sort of purposes that will be used to inform risk assessment activity. So how many rotors does that drone have? How are they rotors configured relative to the nozzles, and how does that sort of material, how does that kind of setup affect things like spray drift or other risks that may exist? You need to do a bit of work around sort of understanding what the working day for a drone operator looks like, again, for modeling purposes, and how that differs from the working day from a worker working with more sort of traditional equipment. And then a bit of work around just outlining general sort of methodologies for regulatory decision making. So say, what is the approach to, well, what are the key risks that arise from drone spraying operations? How do they sort of differ from traditional forms of pesticide sort of application, and what does the risk assessment process for that actually look like? Then there was a final bit of work around getting the manufacturers of drones to make some improvements to their spray systems. So some of the work that we identified, some of the information that was coming back to us, suggested that this was an area for sort of development with some of the new machinery that was coming through. So there is a work package that sort of directed at improving the quality of the machinery that's being used. So the work on these sort of work packages is underway. It's being overseen by my colleague Bryn, who is on the call this afternoon, and a number of members of the subgroup. Now, key elements of this work are being undertaken by an industry sort of task force, and details of the task force and its work are in the sort of paperwork that was circulated for this event. So the way that this will work is that, say, the industry group will develop its information, any sort of models that is necessary to support its work, and present that to the OECD subgroup. The OECD sort of subgroup will then conduct a sort of review of the information and models that are coming forward. So sort of regulators who sit on that group will check the validity of the products that are being sort of put before them to ensure that they're sort of scientifically robust and afford an appropriate degree of sort of protection for human health and the environment. I think it's only if the OECD sort of subgroup is satisfied that it meets those sorts of requirements that we would perhaps be able to move in OECD's paperwork to make recommendations that this type of information and equipment is sufficiently robust for regulators to take it into account when conducting risk assessment activity in relation to drones. So I think that's all I would like to say by way of an introduction on this. And I think that leads us now into the first of the introductory polls. And we have a couple of sort of questions around sort of drone spraying. And the first of those is on the screen at the moment. So ask folks to sort of think about your sort of country, the position in your country at the moment. So just as an interest to know whether drones are used to apply pesticides there at the moment. And if so, if you could sort of share any details of the sorts of situations in which they're used. And they say that's not confined just to sort of agriculture, so sort of perhaps sort of use in sort of rice fields and sort of vineyards and the like, but whether there is use in any sort of non-agricultural situations. For example, in the UK, sort of interest tends not to be in the agricultural sphere, but looking at sort of controlling sort of vegetation in and around sort of railway sort of infrastructure. So be interesting to see or gather information and views from folks on the call this afternoon about the types of sort of drone use that are going on. And I see Zambia have sort of kicked off the discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Grant. I just wanted to, not to interrupt you, but just for people who are new, if you look in the chat, there's a link to Menti. So the poll is in Mentimeter. If you just click on the link, you can go straight in and give your response. And it is most helpful if you do put the country. I see many of you are doing that already. If for some reason you can't find the link in the chat, you can always go to menti.com and put the code at the top. As Grant mentioned, we will be having many polls throughout this discussion, and we will use the same Menti link. So if you could find it, that would be great. And then I see many of you have recently joined. Please continue to introduce yourselves. It's most helpful. We appreciate that. And thank you, Grant, for taking us through. As you can see, we've had over 100 people on already. So there's quite a lot of interest. I will hand back to you and you can continue to comment on the responses that you're seeing on the poll. Thank you.
Good. Yeah, I mean, I see a sort of a variety of responses coming in. I see a number of sort of countries sort of reporting no uses yet, no commercial uses yet. Sort of colleagues in the USA sort of reporting use in sort of cropping situations, and what we would sort of term the biocidal use, sort of use in control of mosquitoes and the like. South Africa sort of reporting use in the sort of sugar industry. So we're seeing sort of use for, you've seen a wide sort of variety of drone use coming through. So not just application of pesticides, but also you're seeing sort of drones being used in the wider sense, some of the remote sensing activities. And I think this is sort of interesting. I think we may see in the future as these new technologies start to come together, you may see what you almost call a sort of hands-free type arrangement, whereby the crop is remotely sort of scanned and assessed, and pests, weeds, and diseases are sort of reviewed by remote sensing technology. Those technologies can communicate with something like a drone sprayer. Sort of drone sprayer can then sort of fly into the field and only treat the areas of the crop which are infected by the pest, weed, and disease. So sort of moving away from systems we have at the moment, where sort of there are sort of crop walkers, sort of specialists who wander through the field, sort of looking at sort of crops in the field, and then sort of machinery going onto the field and treating all of the sort of field. So, and again, that's a reference to sort of spot treatment. I saw one of the comments that were moving through the thing. So there's a picking up a lot of the issues that we sort of identified, and I say it's the wide range of activity that sort of drones are sort of potentially can potentially be used for. So it's a very interesting to get a feel for what's going on, and we see things like the biocidal use, sort of control of mosquitoes, sort of featuring sort of quite sort of prominently in the sorts of comments that are coming through. Sort of locust control from our sort of colleagues in, I think it was Iran, and so it's a new technology which is clearly finding its place in the world, and but there's a range of sort of comments also coming through on the issue of whether sort of particular sort of assessments or assessments are being done, and this sort of forms the basis of the sort of second part of this poll, which you can see on the screen now. So, say for those colleagues who reported that sort of drone application was taking place in their sort of countries, again, be sort of interested to know whether there were particular sort of assessments done on the risks associated with the application of pesticides from the drone. As I mentioned earlier in this sort of workshop, that the OECD exercise didn't uncover a great deal of information that suggested there was a good sort of understanding of what the risks are from sort of drone spraying. So again, for those sort of colleagues who've reported sort of use of drones to apply sort of pesticides, again, just to be sort of helpful for us as the OECD sort of subgroup, just to sort of understand whether there is any information or sort of knowledge out there that we may not have sort of picked up that we could take account of. And I'm seeing largely sort of negative sort of comments coming through at the moment, but a sort of colleague from Iran sort of recognizing the importance of this issue. Yeah, so there's a commentary at the moment. Sort of seems our colleague from Guyana report initial stage now conducting some basic sort of trials around sort of drift studies, and this is sort of something that we'll be sort of looking at later this afternoon. Our sort of colleagues from South Africa. Again, sort of reporting a bit of sort of uncertainty there. I mean, I don't think any of these messages are sort of unsurprising, and I think, I don't know, I mean, the lack of a specific sort of risk assessment isn't necessarily a problem in its own right, provided that the assessments that are being done are made on a suitably sort of precautionary sort of basis. And I don't know, as a rule of thumb, you might sort of say, okay, if we just treat sort of drone spraying as say aerial spraying in a more general sense, then that might be deemed to afford an appropriate degree of protection at this stage. But it may be that in the fullness of time, applying those sorts of rules or that sort of standard to drone spraying may be insufficient to unlock the full potential of drones. So also sort of interesting sort of comments sort of come through on that. Is it time for me to move on now, Andrea, to the next stage?
Yeah, that would be great, Grant. Thanks. So that we do have time for the other questions as well. That would be great. Thank you. This is a very hot topic, but we do need to move on. Thank you.
Good. I'm blown away by the amount of sort of comments. Say lots of interest in this as a sort of subject. So I say we'll be sort of happy to speak to anyone sort of after this meeting if there are any points that they would wish to explore more deeply. So I'd like to return just very sort of briefly to the wider subject of aerial spraying. So here we're talking about not just drones, but also sort of aeroplanes and helicopters. And this is sort of slide says in some countries there are understood to be sort of particular risks associated with sort of aerial spraying and all its forms. And for us as sort of pesticide regulators and sort of driven by the need to assess the impact of chemicals on pesticide and human health, there might be sort of wider sort of concerns with particularly sort of low-flying aircraft maybe if that's in sort of proximity to inhabited areas, transport infrastructure and the like, and also a crossover to work that is carried out in this regard by our sort of civil aviation authorities. So you see on this slide, there's an outline of the controls that those of us who those who apply pesticides from the air in the UK and in the EU, and the UK was part of the EU system until relatively recently. These are the sorts of additional controls that the aerial spraying operators must adhere to. So we have to obtain information, and this is us as the regulatory authority, we have to obtain information on when and where aerial spraying operations are happening, and that sort of information is made available to the public on request. We must also sort of describe, well, we must receive justification of why aerial spraying is beneficial compared to ground-based spraying operations. And we can receive lots of interesting justifications from the aerial spraying operators. Best case tends to come from the guys who treat the military training grounds, and they tell us that it's just too dangerous to drive tractors and other vehicles through vegetation where you may have unexploded bombs. So an airplane applying pesticide to control the vegetation is much the safest way to do that. Also need to know which products are being applied and sort of make sure that those products have been specifically assessed for the risks that come from aerial spraying. And we do need the users of the pesticide, those who are applying or sort of flying the equipment, to be trained and hold certificates showing that they're competent in the safe use of pesticides. The equipment itself has to be sort of registered and identified with our civil aviation authorities, and that applies to the drones. And again, there's a clearance sort of process that our civil aviation authority insists upon. So we work quite closely with the civil aviation authorities in the UK on all forms of aerial spraying. And because of the sort of particular sort of concerns around drift from aerial spraying, we require equipment to be fitted with what we call the best available technology to reduce drift. And we determine best available technology through a process of consulting our sort of industry on what constitutes a reasonable set of standards, but then testing that with sort of specialists within government to sort of make sure that there's a reasonable degree of challenge there. And then there are a series of controls around sort of making sure that aerial spraying doesn't take place too close to residential areas or sensitive sort of environmental areas. And a lot of that is driven by assessment of risk by ourselves as a sort of pesticide regulator with the civil aviation authorities, or by some of the nature conservation authorities here in the UK. As I say, sort of in the UK, sort of aerial spraying is done on a very sort of limited scale, currently less than sort of 10,000 hectares a year being treated. It's done in a very controlled sort of fashion. So we implement the sorts of controls you see on this slide in a very sort of light touch way. And even that may be, this sort of regime may be sort of disproportionately, disproportionate for drones. So we may consider in the fullness of time whether we will consider drones to be aerial spray and captured by the sorts of arrangements that we see on the slide here. So we just move on to poll, the second of the introductory polls. And so thinking about sort of aerial spraying in the wider sort of sense, question one, sorry, aerial spraying in the wider sense. Again, so is it being used? So again, is this more that we're thinking about more than just sort of drone spraying here? Is aerial spraying being undertaken? Is it sort of regulated in your country? And I say, are there sort of particular sort of arrangements for the control of sort of aerial spraying? So that's the first of the questions, sort of, Andrea. Thank you.
Thanks, Grant. So because we've been eating into a bit of time for question 2 already, I've asked people to start posting their responses to question 1, which they've been doing already. There are quite a lot of responses. So I don't know if you want to make a quick comment about regulation, and then I suggest we move on to question 2. But if you or your colleagues want to comment on what's being posted already, there's been quite a lot while you were talking. Thanks.
Can I just check if any of my colleagues on have been keeping an eye on the chat and have got any comments that they would wish to offer?
Claire here. Yes, I've been
Hi,
watching the chat, and there's quite a mix of some that are regulated and some that aren't. But I hadn't got any specific comments. It's moving quite quickly. There seems to be a lot of national regulations, and also some are have aviation permits, but not perhaps the regulation of the pesticide spraying.
Excellent. Okay. So there's sort of colleagues in sort of Kenya require an environmental sort of impact for aerial spraying. Yeah. Again, just a sort of just slightly different sort of model from the sort of arrangement of sort of reporting here for the UK. So just providing sort of additional sort of assurances. Sort of report there from Uganda saying aerial spraying not regulated. Sort of Zambia sort of reporting use again tsetse fly and desert sort of locust. And I say there's a recognition there of the there are different risks associated with the application of pesticides from the air. Sort of spray drift, I think, is a key sort of source of concern, certainly in Europe, and justification for this enhanced sort of level of control. So you see on the sort of next slide, we're talking about the sorts of sort of pests, weeds, and diseases that are being sort of controlled there. And I say we've seen a mix, sort of the sort of locust tsetse sort of fly, sort of use being sort of reported fairly widely. I think in sort of Europe and the sort of UK, the sort of focus tends to be sort of very much in the cropping type scenarios, say, rather than the biocidal uses. So I don't know if there are any more sort of questions or themes sort of coming out of one here. A colleague from South Africa reporting swearing by helicopter to the on the sort of cash crops, and common volume utilised users registration. Everything is 30 litres there. So controls on the volume of sort of product. Kenya sort of reporting use in large scale sort of farming and locust control. And Kenya sort of 20-litre tank drones used for control in worms. Yeah, and it's an interesting sort of reference there to the volume of the equipment, and say that's something we might expect to sort of change over time, so that the tank sizes that the drones are able to carry may increase as the technology advances, and of course that can have an impact on risks throughout the risk assessment process. Bigger tanks require filling sort of less frequently, which may impact things like operator exposure sort of assessments, the sorts of issues we're going to sort of touch on later today. So sort of colleague from sort of Iran reporting sort of aerial spraying taking place around sort of similar types of uses as we have seen with the drones. So I mean, a sort of general sort of impression is a sort of slightly more sort of slightly greater use of aerial spraying by the different techniques. Sort of drones not used to the same extent in all sort of countries, but clearly a developing area and sort of developing sort of technology. So, shall we move on to the next slide now? Thanks. Okay, so we now sort of move on, sort of looking back to sort of drone spraying and this issue of sort of spray drift, which was sort of recalls from the earlier discussion, one of the key issues that has been sort of identified in the OECD work in trying to establish how the risk from drone spraying differs from existing and more sort of traditional forms of application. And so one of the challenges for the OECD work was to establish how the drift from drone applied pesticides differs, and if so, what does that actually look like? As I say, this is probably the most sort of single important sort of finding from the initial stage of the OECD work. So the amount of sort of drift that you get from a drone and how it interacts with the crop it's being applied to, or the situation it's being applied to, and how the spray or the crop is affected by any draft that comes off the rotors will dictate how the pesticide moves sort of to and through the wider environment. So potentially exposing people and the environment and watercourses and wildlife to the properties of the chemicals that are being applied. Now, at the moment, there are models for assessing spray drift from the aerial application of sort of pesticides, but they are most relevant to sort of the aircraft and the helicopters that we're discussing. And the emerging view would seem to be that those models probably overestimate the drift that arises from drone spraying. Yeah. As we said earlier, it may be sort of acceptable in some cases for the industries to live with the sorts of restrictions that would come from considering the drift equivalent to that comes from aircraft and helicopters, a reasonably restrictive set of conditions. But our suspicion is that that's not going to be the case, and that we would look to develop some sort of bespoke sort of assessment that takes account of the specific risks that arises from the drift that comes from drones. And the slide here, I say it sort of picks up and in the final bullet, the need to sort of ensure that any studies that are done to make assessments of the drift that comes from drones are sort of conducted to an appropriate standard. And there's this sort of concept of sort of good laboratory sort of practice to sort of make sure that the data is sufficiently robust and that studies are carefully designed. So I think we can just move on to the next sort of poll question, please. Thank you. Okay, so the first of the sort of the poll sort of question here is to sort of ask folks to sort of think about the sort of factors that determine the amount of sort of spray drift from pesticides that come from a drone. So I say sort of think about the design of the drone itself. Maybe also think about the way the drone sort of flies, the way it sort of interacts with the crop. So folks could start just to think and post some ideas or thoughts on the you say the factors around sort of designing the drone, the way it sort of flies, and how that might impact on drift. Thank you.
Thanks, Grant. So we're asking people to post their comments to this question in the chat. There is a question already, Grant, from Tom. I'm not sure if you can see that, from Tom Murray from South Africa. He says, given the size of drones, would a more concentrated mix of pesticide use be used?
So it's certainly a sort of possibility, and it's something that we have seen being used. My colleague sort of Tony, who looks after the efficacy of sort of plant protection sort of products here in the UK, I know has done some thinking or work on this. Tony, do you want to pick up that point? Any sort of comments you'd like to make?
Well, I mean, with regarding the concentration, it does depend a bit on the mode of action and whether it's going to be systemic or whether it's contact. And if it's contact, are you getting sufficient coverage for the product or formulations still to be efficacious? But it is still one of those areas which we need to look at in more detail and address, and whether actual ultra low volume is going to be appropriate for this sort of use. But it will probably depend on the actual situation involved. Thanks, Grant.
Smashing, Tony. And I see that there are some other comments coming through, Tony, about sort of nozzle sort of size and selection. Is there any sort of thoughts you would like to sort of share with the group on those sorts of issues?
I think at the moment it seems, from the information we've seen so far, the nozzle specifications being chosen are more with regard to drift, and the actual effect of changing nozzle and droplet spectrums with regards to effectiveness, again, is yet something to be addressed and looked at in more detail. So if anybody has information on that, we'd obviously be interested to see it. Thank you.
Terrific. And there's also a reference, Tony, while you're on the line, to sort of products that are being used. At the moment, the thinking is it's very much use of sort of existing sort of products, but we have got sort of the potential, haven't we, for drone specific sort of product formulations to be developed in the fullness of time.
Yeah, I mean the current situation we're looking at the moment is effectively the standard formulations we're seeing being used on ground-based applications and broad acre applications. Although there is some documents I've seen that in certain places they are developing specific formulations for use through drone application. These tend to be the smaller sized rotary driven sort of drones rather than the aeroplane type of drones, which may be about as well used in places. But again, if anybody has further information, we'd be interested in seeing that as well.
Super. And I've seen a number of sort of comments coming through the chat on things like sort of rotors, sort of configuration and the like. Claire, I know this is an area that this is Claire Glennie from the UK sort of HSE. I know, Claire, this is a subject you've looked at sort of quite closely. Have you got any sort of thoughts or comments based on the sorts of sort of comments we've seen sort of coming through the chat and on the poll?
Yeah, a lot of the same things being picked up, I guess, that we've been thinking about in terms of, the height above the ground, above the crop canopy, forward speed, the impact of the rotors on interactions with the nozzles and where the nozzles are positioned in relation to the rotors, interaction of with the canopy, and whether you get a bounce effect from droplets hitting the ground and then traveling further, the weather conditions, wind speed and direction, and temperature. You can have greater evaporation will increase risk of drift. Yep. Obviously the droplet size and the nozzle type, very important.
And is there an issue sort of clear around the sort of position of the sort of the nozzle sort of relative to the position of the rotors?
It's something we probably need more information on to confirm, but I guess there's one of the things that it might be probable that if you can keep the nozzles within 75% of the rotor diameter, then that's currently done with manned aircraft, and I thought possibly might be a way of reducing the drift. Sometimes the nozzles are put directly under the rotors with the intention of the downdraft helping to direct the spray downwards, but there's questions that we need to investigate in terms of whether the forward speed at a certain critical speed that might cancel out the downdraft, and the downdraft might also be weakened by the flight height being increased.
Excellent, thanks. I say it's challenging keeping up with it with the amount of sort of comment that is coming through. It's good to see such interest and sort of interaction with the with the subject, and yeah, I'm seeing sort of lots of sort of good understanding from folks on the sorts of issues that so we in OECD had sort of identified, and it's sort of reassuring that we're sort of receiving sort of similar messages from yourself. We see this very much as an opportunity for us to sort of learn to and sort of make sure that we're identifying the right sorts of issues. So the second sort of part of this sort of question is then sort of considering how we might actually sort of go about determining how much sort of drift comes off of a drone spraying sort of operation. And the question you see is couched in sort of terms of how might we design a study to determine how much sort of drift is expected from a drone spraying sort of operation. So again, sort of interested to sort of hear thoughts from anyone sort of on the call who's sort of been who may have been involved in this sort of activity, or even if you just have sort of good sort of ideas as to what a drift study might actually sort of look like. So again, sort of folks, feel free to comment.
So Grant, there's a question from Sharika. I don't know if you've seen that. She asks, will the use of drones be confined to only a specific type of pesticides, or can any type of pesticide mixture be used?
Yeah, I mean, I say I can ask sort of Tony for sort of fuller sort of comments, but my sort of view is that any sort of pesticide product, whether say a herbicide, insecticide, fungicide, for example, is capable of being applied from a drone. I'm not aware that there are any sort of restrictions that would necessitate sort of classes of sort of pesticides being exempt or being prohibited from being applied by a drone. But I don't know, sort of Tony and or any of my other sort of HSE sort of colleagues on the call, are you aware of any sort of specific sort of restrictions that might come into play with that issue?
Hi, Grant. I'm not aware that technically speaking, there shouldn't be any restrictions on the different types of products being used, as you say, whether it be insecticide, whether it be a fungicide. Herbicides, again, I think that might be restricted more by its end use and its relevance to it. As we've, as you mentioned earlier, about the control of weeds in structures, but if you're applying weeds to any broadacre crop, is the relevance still there? And then again, with regards to formulation type, if you're applying a powder, that's going to obviously be very different to a liquid. But I would suspect that the vast majority of applications that are being looked at the moment would be via a liquid application rather than any sort of granular or anything like that.
Well, thank you, Tony.
So I guess the issue would be more than the sort of type of pesticide would be the toxicity of the pesticide, given that you're more inclined to having spray drift with the drone. So I think probably the issue to discuss is the hazard associated with the pesticide rather than the type. I see Brian and Claire wanted to come in.
Thank you. I was just going to say it may be practical considerations that influence the choice of pesticides. For example, it's much easier to use a liquid-based product rather than a powder-based product because it's just much easier to mix up in a small volume. And also in the chat, Dr. Jane Bonds has pointed out that many people that work in America are working off the manned aircraft application labels that are available in the US. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Was it Claire, the other one?
I think I recall something about there being less agitation, less scope for agitation in the tank for drones compared to aerial, manned aerial application. That possibly had some implications in terms of things that might have more potential to block nozzles, but I'm not completely sure of my facts on that one.
Smashing. Claire, I don't know, Claire, if you're able to sort of see some of the comments that are moving through on sort of design of sort of study at the moment. Certainly, many of the sort of the features that are being suggested there are they're sort of recognisable to me. But as you as a drift sort of study sort of expert, I don't know if you sort of any comments on the sorts of comments we've seen sort of coming through the chat. And Claire, are you still there?
I am sorry, I was just having a quick read through.
I say,
there's one reference to it.
Sorry,
using vapors every 30 meters in the directions around the spray area.
So
I couldn't see any others on spray drift design.
Yeah, I think
you were asking about.
Yeah, I think the sorts of comments that folks are picking up there are there. Say they're very much in line with our sort of own thinking as to how a spray drift study might be sort of developed, and kind of a way of sort of time is pressing on a bit, and we probably need to move on to the next sort of area. So we'll take stock of the comments and suggestions that have come through there, and say if people on the call do have any additional sort of thoughts or sort of questions that they would, or points they would like to sort of share with us, we can pick that up in the aftermath of this meeting and explore those with you. Okay, shall we move on to the sort of the next slide, please? Thanks.
Yes, Grant, and just to remind people that we do produce a digest that we will circulate at the end of this discussion, and any unanswered questions you can also address in the digest.
Super. Okay, so the final sort of area that we're going to look at is the other sort of key aspect of the risk assessment sort of process that was identified as a result of the OECD exercise is that of what we call sort of operator sort of exposure. So this is the exposure of the workers who are sort of handling and filling the drone, but also, and we mustn't sort of forget the potential for the application of the pesticide to impact any any sort of bystanders or sort of residents who may be living adjacent to the spray operation. And you can see that sort of workers will obviously be in very sort of close proximity to the chemical, and potentially be subject to greater sort of immediate exposure, albeit that they may be wearing the likes of sort of PPE to protect them. But people who are living nearby could be exposed to spray drift or enter into sort of treated areas. And there is sort of a variety of ways we can limit the exposure of the workers or those who may be adjacent to sort of spray operations. And it's this sort of element I would like to sort of consider now with the last sort of couple of sort of questions that we're going to look like. We're going to look at this afternoon. So the first of those is one we have on the screen now at the moment, and grateful for your thoughts. So what are the factors that could determine worker exposure when using and handling drones that are used to apply pesticides? So again, we identified a number of sort of points in the OECD exercise, which we're sort of happy to sort of share with you in the sort of fullness of the time. But we're sort of grateful for any thoughts from folks in the workshop this afternoon on this sort of particular issue. So we look forward to hearing from you now, please. Thank you.
Thanks, Grant. This is a very important question. So we will move into the chat for a bit, and I can see some of you are posting, so continue to post your responses to question 3 in the chat. Thanks. Okay, so we've got the elimination of highly hazardous pesticides. I'm assuming the reference to HHPS is there. That's sort of interesting. It sort of raises the debate around sort of use of sort of hazard and risk, isn't there? And there's sort of it was certainly a very sort of live issue in Europe around sort of 10 years ago, where we moved from having a pesticide regulatory regime that was purely sort of risk-based. So it didn't necessarily matter if the sort of soup of sort of chemicals that made up a pesticide product contained products with some hazardous sort of properties. The sort of the rationale on which the regulatory system was based was provided that you could mitigate or control exposure to the hazard to a sort of degree to which the hazardous property didn't actually result in any adverse effects on human health and the environment, and the regime was quite content to work in that way, so that there wasn't an element of sort of hazard assessment. And then about 10 years ago, the EU system that we operate introduced these so-called sort of hazard triggers into the system, and the fact that a chemical had certain properties then became a sort of potential sort of bar for it being excluded for use in plant protection products. So it's interesting that whole sort of hazard sort of risk debate. And I mean, my sense is sort of generally that sort of hazard is becoming, I don't know, sort of becoming sort of more of a sort of factor in sort of considering the way sort of regulators in a global sense sort of look at sort of pesticide sort of regulator, albeit that it doesn't necessarily sort of feed through in terms of sort of regulatory regimes in all cases. So yeah, I'm seeing we've got some commentary sort of coming through regarding the likes of sort of handling and filling operations, and you can see things like the number of sort of handling and filling operations that are conducted
during a day, maybe more with a drone, say, than other forms, or the more sort of traditional forms of application equipment. So the sort of question might be, are there sort of more points of exposure for workers during the day with a drone than other types of equipment? We also see reference in here to sort of cleaning. So that's cleaning of equipment. So there's obviously, what happens to the residues of the pesticide that may be on the outside of the drone. What do you then do with the cleaning sort of material, any sort of wastewater that is produced? We're sort of, what else have we got in here? So as a reference to sort of weather conditions and the like, and a number of sort of references in here to some of the sort of mitigation sort of measures, use of sort of PPE and the like, which we'll sort of pick up in the final sort of question that's coming through. So I think here we've got say there are a number of ways in which sort of the workers or even the bystanders and residents can sort of be exposed to the chemicals that they're being used. And say for the workers around the handling and filling operations, the sort of cleaning sort of operations, the kind of things like the filling sort of aperture in drones, because they tend to be a sort of a smaller sort of piece of a smaller piece of equipment. Are there sort of particular sort of challenges with sort of transferring the mix of pesticide sort of product into the tank from which it will be applied upon the drone? But potentially sort of use of things like sort of closed transfer sort of systems, which we know a number of sort of manufacturers are sort of developing, maybe a way to do that. Take account of things like the length of the sort of the working day. Is the length of the sort of working day for a drone operator going to be different from that of those who operate more traditional types of equipment? And sort of proximity to the spray operation. The fact that you can sort of fly a drone at sort of distance mean that exposures may be less than say sort of farmers sitting in a tractor with the spray immediately behind them. And I see a number of sort of comments coming through. I say there's comments there on sort of inhabitants, the bystanders in surrounding areas, perhaps as a suggestion that they may need to be sort of pre-warned of spray operations. That's a suggestion that sort of warning signs be erected to help them sort of stay out of the treated area. And I think for us as sort of regulators and how we're thinking in terms of the OECD work is it's all around sort of building sort of standard sort of models, so you can conduct a sort of risk assessment. So the thinking is that we may want to get the users of the drones to come together and start sort of developing a model for a standard sort of working day. So they suggest that the drone operator works an 8-hour day, that they will sort of refill the drone on maybe 4 or 5 times during the day, and they will be an average of say sort of 30 meters from the spray sort of operation. So that type of sort of information built into a standard sort of model working day, and that can then be used as sort of regulators as a reasonable sort of basis for assessing sort of risk. And then looking at sort of risks to sort of bystanders and bystanders and residents. Obviously, the spray drift is a very sort of key sort of sort of form of potential sort of exposure there. So we go back to that previous example of looking at sort of drift and the amount of drift and making assessments based there. Then need to sort of think about the fact that residues of the sprayed sort of crop will remain and potentially are accessible to say workers who may sort of re-enter the treated area. So sort of taking account of the sort of medium to sort of longer term sort of exposures that may occur in addition to those immediately to the sort of spray operation. So again, seeing lots of very sort of useful and sort of helpful sort of comments coming through. I think it's clear that people have a very sort of good understanding of the sorts of sort of risks that we're looking to address. So can we just move on to the sort of the final sort of question here? And appreciate that some of these have, or a number of these have been sort of addressed in the sorts of comments that we've seen coming through on the chat sort of immediately. So again, thinking not just sort of from a regulatory sort of perspective, but what other sort of non-regulatory sort of steps in addition can be taken to control exposures of, say, workers, bystanders, and residents. And say, feel free to sort of repeat any of the sort of comments that folks have made in response to the sort of previous to the previous question there. Thank you.
Thanks, Grant. Just a reminder that the Menti link is in the chat. So if anyone would like to make a response and post on the poll, you can just click on that link, and do remember to put your country in. Thank you.
Super. And I say, while folks are sort of thinking of any additional sort of comments here, I don't know if there's been anything come through on the chat that my sort of HSE sort of colleagues have been able to sort of pick up on that I may have missed. I think there's probably a short window of opportunity to make any additional sort of comments from my HSE colleagues. Thank you. So I do see a comment on the chat about whether there are any chemicals that cannot be applied by drone. I say, because similar to a question we sort of had earlier, and I say that of course there are sort of particular sort of chemicals whose use is sort of prohibited. In terms of any sort of pesticide that currently has an authorization, I don't think we'd look to sort of preclude their application by drone. It is seen in that regard as another sort of technology tool, piece of equipment to apply sort of product. So again, in terms of the regulatory and sort of non-regulatory sort of steps, we're seeing sort of reference to need for sort of proper sort of mixing, impact assessment before sort of spraying. South Africa talking about the hierarchy of sort of controls, again sort of familiar to those of us who work in the health and safety sort of health and safety sort of sphere. So we can see things on the regulatory side, like use of the pesticide sort of authorization, the product label can impose controls through things like the need to wear personal protective equipment. In a sort of a non-regulatory sort of perspective, there are sort of opportunities for things such as sort of codes of sort of practice, and whether they're sort of developed by sort of governments, whether they are developed by industry bodies that can set out good and best sort of practice sort of standards for handling and filling operations. And I think in that regard, I would say for anybody who is not familiar with what might sort of constitute good and best practice on handling and filling operations, I'd refer you to the code of practice that we use here in the UK, and a link to the code of practice was included with the paperwork for this event. And I think within that code of practice, there's a significant sort of section that talks about good and best sort of practice when it comes to handling and filling sort of pesticides. So sort of very, very detailed sort of outline of what would be sort of required or what would be helpful. And I say, I think that's a good sort of non-regulatory sort of way to sort of help users of pesticides sort of identify what a set of sort of practices might look like. And if people do want to sort of understand a bit more about that, we'd be sort of happy to speak and explain a bit more about that. So just sort of looking through, we're seeing sort of references to avoiding aerial applications near sort of schools and water bodies and sensitive sort of ecological sort of places. So again, sort of using the sort of regulatory regime to control it, limiting the number of sort of people sort of spraying, sort of prohibiting spraying at certain times of the day. We're sort of aware that the weather sort of conditions can affect things such as sort of drift. So again, a lot of sort of good suggestions and sort of thoughtful sort of comment coming through on this sort of issue of sort of regulatory and non-regulatory sort of steps to control sort of exposure. So, and it's sort of clear that people have a good feel for the sorts of issues that are here, and we can take and sort of examine the sort of comments that are coming through, see whether they sort of build and sort of accord with the sorts of messages that we've been picking up as a result of our work with the OECD. So I think, so looking at the time, it's probably time for me to sort of move on from the last of the sort of questions there and just conclude. So can we move on to the next slide, so Tatum? Thank you. So just to sort of conclude, I mean, I think for us as regulators, those of us who are regulators on the OECD, what they say, we can see the benefits of a regulatory regime that enables rather than sort of impedes the adoption of new technologies such as drones. And the work we're doing here, though, I say it will have wider implications for how the regulatory regimes function. And we do feel an obligation to have our sort of regimes ready to sort of interact with these new technologies that are being developed. I think there are still some questions around for whether drones will replace more traditional machinery in what we call the broadacre sort of cropping. So in a sort of European or a UK sense, we're talking about sort of essentially sort of wheat and barley sort of crops. Are drones going to sort of replace more traditional forms of application for pesticides in all countries? Or does the sort of future for drones in some countries lie in some of the more specialist sort of scenarios? And an example of that would be the one I sort of mentioned earlier in the UK, sort of use on transport infrastructure, and that situation is likely to sort of vary across the countries of the world. I think for the industries that are involved with sort of drone spraying, I think sort of potentially the regulatory sort of challenges might be sort of big for them. They're sort of stakeholders, sort of bodies who traditionally may not have sort of engaged with the pesticide sort of regulatory regime, and sort of generating sort of data to support sort of applications for drone specific pesticide authorizations may be sort of quite sort of expensive. So certainly the approach we've taken here in the UK is to look to bring the different sort of stakeholders together. So the crop protection companies, the drone companies, sort of the training providers, the research institutes. We've put them together in one room and said, look, you guys need to sort of talk to one another, pool your information, pool your sort of resources and expertise, and that's really will maximize your sort of chances working with the sort of regulator to get the best sort of regulatory regime, one that enables you to make best use of the drones, but enables the regulators to assure themselves that we're putting in place a regime which is sort of sufficiently sort of protective of human health and the environment. And as I say, I mean, I think I've said this a number of times, the work that we're doing here with drones, it's a bit of a sort of pathfinder in as much as it will help us to, as regulators, to sort of develop sort of attitudes and approaches to new technologies more widely. And I say it's driving some innovative sort of thinking on the way that we assess risk. And I think with that sort of, Andrea, I'd probably sort of like to sort of draw a conclusion to sort of my input to today's sort of workshop. I mean, let's sort of thank folks for the enormous sort of amount of sort of interest and sort of comments. I think we've sort of learned a lot in terms of sort of the feedback and got a lot of sort of useful information that's come through from folks on the call today. And I'll just sort of reiterate that point that if anybody does have any sort of particular sort of questions or sort of issues that we haven't had an opportunity to sort of pick up, then we'd sort of be delighted to discuss and hear from anyone on the call. So thank you.
Thanks, Grant. That was very efficient. We do still have a few minutes, so I don't know if there's any pressing questions. You can maybe glance and see if there's anything that you want to address. I think you'll see that there's an evaluation that's being posted for members at the moment. So we do ask people to take the opportunity to indicate how you're going to use the information that you learned today. I think it was very telling. We had at one stage 100 people online. We also were aware that there were other people trying to join, but our Zoom was capped. We haven't had 100 people before in all the years that we've been doing these discussions. It has been the first that we've hit 100. So it's obviously showing that this is a very important topic, a very hot topic, and I think also a topic that many regulators are challenged with. So this is a great opportunity. I mean, it's really good that the OECD is doing work on this, and hopefully that will set a precedent and give guidance to other regional bodies. I know the Southern African Pesticide Regulators Forum has not developed a guideline yet, and perhaps they will build on what's being done by the OECD. And it would be good to know if other regional bodies are thinking about doing some sort of guidance. I think the question is, that in many countries, aerial application is actually not allowed. And so will drone application bypass that? Will it be different, or will drones not be allowed in countries where aerial application is not allowed?
And that will be a question for sort of individual countries. I mean, I'd say for the UK, that we say we have until this point sort of viewed drone spraying as aerial application. But if we look at it purely in terms of risk and sort of risk driven by drift, the emerging position seems to be that the amount of drift you get from a drone is significantly less than that you would get from a helicopter or an aircraft. So at the very least, we're going to sort of ask the question that in pure pesticide risk terms, is drone spraying equivalent to the more traditional forms of aerial application? And if the answer is no, we then have a decision to make as to how we sort of classify drone spraying in the longer term. So that's how we'll deal with it in the UK, but each country will want to sort of look at it in its own way.
Yes, thanks. Thanks for highlighting that. I think that's a very important point. So I'd like to, first of all, thank you, Grant. Thank you for the time that you've taken to prepare for this discussion. And you've taken us through many important questions, both in terms of poll questions and questions that we discussed in the chat, and you raised so many issues. I'd like to also thank your colleagues who came on board to help answer questions. It was quite a lot, as I said, a lot of members, a lot being posted. I'd also like to thank Tatum in the background, who organized the administrative side of the discussion and made sure that it was running smoothly. I'd like to thank all the participants. It's hard to stimulate and have a discussion online, and this is a good way of doing it through the chat. And we really do appreciate you taking the time to post your comments and your responses. I'd like to remind you that our next discussion for the Pesticide Discussion Forum will be on the 28th of April. We're going to be looking at online pesticide sales, which is going to be led by Beatrice Grenier from the Food and Agriculture Organization. Please do sign up if you're not a member of the Pesticide Discussion Forum with UCT that's funded by Sweden through Chemi. We will have a digest that will be circulated to everyone who has signed up. You can also get the recording and the PowerPoint of this presentation, this discussion as well if you sign up as a member. So again, thanks to everyone, and thank you, Grant, and enjoy the rest of your day. And I hope this won't be the last of the drone discussions.
Happy to come back and discuss again if needs be. Thank you.
I think there will be definitely a need for that. Yes. So thank you again to you and your team. Bye. Bye for now.
Bye-bye, folks.